Bastian arrives at a Tuscan studio where Lorenzo introduces him to the patient art of restoring broken ceramics. Surrounded by the scent of wild rosemary and the hum of olive groves, Bastian must learn to quiet his restless city mind to master the delicate process. Listen as a shared creative journey transforms a jagged bowl into a golden record of survival. Plate of sunlight. It is not a tragedy of loss, Bastian, but a record of survival. Lorenzo's hand, mapped with deep creases and stained by a lifetime of oxides, hovered over the ruins of a ceramic bowl. The pieces lay scattered across a heavy oak workbench, the wood scarred by 1,000 knife slips and kiln drops. The bowl had been a deep, midnight cobalt, now reduced to a jagged archipelago of shards that caught the light in sharp, unpredictable angles. Lorenzo didn't move to touch them, he simply pointed, his finger steady despite the tremor that occasionally claimed his left wrist. Bastian stood a pace back, the sudden silence of the studio ringing in his ears. His right hand acted on a muscle memory honed by 3 years in a Florence agency. It slid into his pocket to find the glass screen of his phone. His thumb twitched, ghosting over a phantom notification, a reflex search for the digital hum that usually filled the voids of his day. He felt the phantom vibration against his thigh, a nervous energy that made the stillness of the room feel like a vacuum. He didn't pull the phone out, but the gesture was a loud admission of restlessness. Lorenzo let out a low, raspy sigh, a sound like gravel sliding over silk. He didn't look up, yet he had seen it. The sigh wasn't a reprimand, but it carried the weight of a long-standing observation. The old man finally turned his gaze toward his grandson, his eyes clouded but piercing. He fixed on Bastian not as a visitor, but as a piece of clay that had been fired too quickly and was now prone to cracking. Outside, the Tuscan afternoon had reached its zenith, pressing against the studio walls with a physical density. The heat was a heavy blanket, thick and tasting of sun-baked terracotta and dried rosemary. It seeped through the open shutters, carrying the scent of the valley's dust and the distant, sharp tang of a nearby irrigation pump. Inside the studio, the air felt stagnant, as if the oxygen itself had been baked into a slow, viscous syrup. Every breath required a conscious effort, a deliberate pull that forced Bastian to notice the rhythm of his own lungs. "You are still running," Lorenzo said, his voice slow and deliberate. "Even here, in the silence, your mind is sprinting toward a finish line that does not exist. Look at the bowl, Bastian. Really look at it. Do not see a broken object. See a history." Bastian shifted his weight, his sneakers squeaking softly on the terracotta tiles. "I see a bowl that needs to be fixed, Nonno. If we use the right adhesive, maybe we can make the seams disappear. We can make it look like it never happened." Lorenzo's thumb began to rub against his index finger, a slow, rhythmic friction that seemed to ground him to the earth. "That is the mistake of the city. You wish to erase the trauma. You wish to return to a state of perceived perfection. But kintsugi is not about restoration. It is about illumination. We do not hide the fracture with glue. We highlight it with gold. We acknowledge that the break is the most honest part of the object's life." Impatience, sharp and jagged, flared in Bastian's chest. He wanted to touch the shards, to organize them, to solve the puzzle of the cobalt fragments. He stepped forward, his movement sudden and hurried, cutting through the thick air. He reached for a large curve of the bowl, intending to fit it against the base, but the oppressive heat seemed to push back against him. The air felt like water, slowing his reach, making his haste feel clumsy and out of place in the solemnity of the studio. "Wait," Lorenzo murmured, though the word arrived too late. "The lacquer is a patient master. The clay is a patient witness. If you handle them with haste, you invite the microfracture." Bastian didn't listen. He gripped the cobalt shard too tightly, his fingers squeezing the fragile edge in a rush to prove he could handle the task. There was a sound, barely audible, a tiny, crystalline snap. A sliver of ceramic, no larger than a grain of rice, sheared off from the edge of the shard and skittered across the wooden table, disappearing into a gap between the planks. Bastian froze. He loosened his grip, staring at the now jagged edge of the fragment. He looked up at his grandfather, expecting a lecture, a frown, or a sharp correction. Instead, Lorenzo remained silent. He didn't move a muscle, save for the slow rub of his thumb against his finger. The silence stretched, expanding to fill the room, becoming more oppressive than the heat. It was a silence that didn't judge, but simply presented the fact a piece of the history was now gone, an irrevocable loss caused by a second of impatience. Bastian felt a sudden hot flush of embarrassment creep up his neck. He watched his own hands, smooth, pale, and shaking slightly. Then he studied Lorenzo's hands. They were the color of the earth, scarred and stained, yet they possessed a stillness that Bastian found terrifying. It was a stillness that didn't come from a lack of motion, but from a total mastery of it. The contrast was jarring. Bastian felt like a glitch in a slow-motion film, a frantic digital entity trapped in an analog world. "That sliver cannot be recovered," Lorenzo said eventually, his voice devoid of anger. "It has returned to the dust. Now, the repair will have to account for that void. The gold will fill a gap that was not there a moment ago. The bowl is now even more broken than it was when it fell." Bastian sank his hands into his pockets, the fabric of his trousers damp with sweat. He felt a strange, hollow sensation in his stomach. In Florence, a mistake was a Ctrl+Z away from vanishing. A line could be deleted, a color shifted, a deadline pushed. Here, the air was thick with the permanence of things. The heat seemed to intensify, pinning him to the spot, forcing him to exist in the immediate present of his own failure. He watched a single beam of golden sunlight pierce through the shutters, cutting a sharp diagonal across the room. The light hit the floor, illuminating the deep red of the terracotta tiles. As the light shifted, it revealed a long, winding crack in the floor, a fracture in the foundation of the studio itself that had likely been there for decades. The crack mirrored the jagged geometry of the cobalt shards on the table, a silent testament to the fact that the very ground they stood on was imperfect, broken, and yet still holding them up. Lorenzo followed his grandson's gaze to the floor, and then back to the bowl. A ghost of a smile touched the corners of his mouth, though his eyes remained serious. "The house is breaking, the bowl is breaking, and you are breaking, Bastian. The question is not how to stop the break, but how we choose to fill the gaps." Lorenzo reached out and gently pushed the shards toward the center of the table, an invitation. He didn't tell him to start, he didn't give him a manual. He simply stepped back, leaving Bastian alone with the ruins and the humming heat of the afternoon, the silence demanding a patience that Bastian wasn't sure he possessed. Pulling shard. Bastian leaned over the workbench, his chest tight, his breathing coming in short, shallow bursts that sounded too loud in the heavy silence of the studio. The cobalt shards were a jagged archipelago across the scarred oak surface, and he felt a desperate, itching need to force them back together. He reached for a piece, his movements jerky and hurried, trying to slot a curved edge into a corresponding void. It didn't fit. He tried another, pressing too hard, and the ceramic scraped against the wood with a shrill, grating sound that set his teeth on edge. He wanted the puzzle solved. He wanted the mistake erased. He wanted to be back in Florence, where a misplaced vector could be snapped into alignment with a single keystroke. Then his fingertips brushed the raw edge of a larger fragment. The ceramic was shockingly cold, a deep subterranean chill that seemed to seep through his skin and anchor his racing pulse. He stopped. He let his fingers linger on the glazed surface, feeling the contrast between the smooth, glassy exterior and the gritty, porous underside. The coldness was a sudden sensory shock, a physical weight that pulled his mind out of the frantic loop of failure and back into the room. He focused on the temperature, the way the cool stone seemed to suck the heat from his skin, and for a moment the air in the studio felt less like a weight and more like a breath. The sound of measured, rhythmic footsteps echoed from the hallway, cutting through the stillness. Ismael entered the room, his presence as precise as a blueprint. He didn't wander in, he arrived. He stopped 3 feet from the table, his posture perfectly vertical, and raised a hand to adjust his glasses. The frames caught the light, a brief flash of silver before he leaned in to survey the wreckage. He didn't look at Bastian first. He watched the shards, his eyes scanning the layout with the clinical intensity of a surveyor assessing a fault line. "The distribution is haphazard," Ismael said, his voice clear and articulated, each syllable landing with mathematical precision. "You are attempting to assemble the pieces based on proximity rather than geometry. If you establish the primary axis of the bowl first, the remaining fragments will fall into place according to their original curvature. The goal is the restoration of the original form, is it not?" Bastian looked up, his eyes narrowing. The logic appealed to him instantly. It was a project with a set of rules, a clear definition of correct and incorrect. It was the language of the grid, the logic of the software he spent 10 hours a day manipulating. He felt his shoulders drop an inch, the tension shifting from panic to a desire for order. He began to move the pieces, trying to isolate the base, trying to find that primary axis Ismael spoke of. He felt a sudden surge of kinship with the architect. They were both men of the city, men who believed that the world could be solved if only the measurements were accurate enough. "The original form is a ghost." Lorenzo's voice drifted from the corner of the room, low and raspy, like gravel sliding over silk. He hadn't moved from his spot, but his presence seemed to expand to fill the gap between the two younger men. He stepped forward slowly, his thumb rubbing against his index finger in a slow, tactile rhythm. To seek the original is to deny the event. The bowl did not simply vanish and reappear, it broke. It suffered a trauma. To pretend the break never happened is not repair, Bastian, it is a lie. Ismael frowned, his brow furrowing as he stepped closer to the table. Precision is not a lie, Signor Moretti. It is the only way to ensure structural integrity. If the alignment is off by even a millimeter, the tension in the lacquer will be uneven. The piece will be aesthetically compromised because it lacks the symmetry of its inception. Ismael reached out, his long fingers hovering over a cluster of shards. With a swift, decisive motion, he began to slide 3 pieces into a tight, mathematical grid, aligning them with a rigor that felt almost aggressive. Lorenzo didn't raise his voice. He simply moved his hand, a slow and inevitable motion, and gently pushed Ismael's hand away from the shards. It wasn't a shove, but a redirection, a quiet assertion of territory. The honest line, Lorenzo said, his voice rhythmic and steady, is the line that acknowledges the fracture. We do not hide the break under the guise of symmetry. We follow the organic flow of the ruin. The gold does not go where the bowl used to be. It goes where the break is now. Bastian watched the two men, the architect and the potter, and felt himself caught in the middle of a silent war between precision and intuition. He looked down at his own hands, which had begun to tap a restless, rhythmic beat on the oak table. Tap, tap, tap. He wanted the symmetry of Ismael's grid, the comfort of a known answer, but he felt the pull of Lorenzo's stillness. He studied the cobalt shards again, no longer seeing a puzzle to be solved, but a map of a moment of violence. The gap he had created by losing the sliver of ceramic felt like a physical ache in his chest, a void that no amount of mathematical alignment could fill. He reached for a particularly jagged piece, a shard that looked like a frozen lightning bolt. As he lifted it, he noticed something odd. He turned the piece over in his hand, the coldness of the clay still biting into his skin. On the interior side, sheltered from the blue glaze, there was a series of faint, handwritten marks. He squinted, bringing the shard closer to his eyes, his breath hitching. It wasn't a maker's mark or a date. It was a sentence, written in a spindly, faded ink that had bled into the porous clay over decades. He zoomed in, his vision narrowing until the rest of the room, Lorenzo's watchful gaze, Ismael's rigid posture, the humming heat of the afternoon, dissolved into a blur. He saw the curve of a letter, a sharp descent of a pen, a smudge where a finger had once rested. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic, contrasting sharply with the stillness of the studio. He traced the letters with the tip of his fingernail, feeling the slight indentation in the clay. The words were in a language he didn't fully recognize, but the emotion behind the script was unmistakable, a whispered secret etched into the bone of the object before it had ever been fired in the kiln. Bastian froze, the shard trembling slightly in his grip. He realized with a jolt of electricity that this piece of ceramic didn't match the curvature of the cobalt bowl. The glaze was a shade too dark, the weight slightly different. He looked down at the table, at the ruins he had been trying so hard to organize. This shard was an intruder, a fragment from another life, somehow woven into the wreckage of the bowl. He didn't call out to Lorenzo. He didn't alert Ismael. Instead, he slid the shard toward the edge of the table, shielding it with his forearm, a sudden instinctive need to keep the discovery for himself. Lorenzo's eyes shifted, landing on Bastian's guarded posture. He didn't ask what he had found, but the tilt of his head suggested he knew. The silence in the room changed. It was no longer the silence of a lesson, but the silence of a shared secret. Bastian felt a bead of sweat roll down his temple, but he didn't wipe it away. For the first time since arriving in Tuscany, he wasn't thinking about the finish line. He was thinking about the gap, the void left by the missing sliver, and the strange, hidden presence of the shard that didn't belong. A rhythmic brush. The brush made a rhythmic, hypnotic shh as Lorenzo swept it across the edge of a ceramic shard. He didn't look up, his focus absolute. Late afternoon light filtered through the high windows in slanted bars, illuminating dust motes that settled on the rough-hewn workbenches. Beside him, the scent of damp earth and old linseed oil hung heavy, a smell baked into the walls over half a century. Bastian watched his grandfather's hand. The skin was mapped with deep creases and age spots, but the movement was fluid, devoid of the tremor that claimed Lorenzo's fingers when he held a teacup. The brush moved with a consistency that suggested a machine, yet it possessed a living quality. It wasn't just cleaning, it was a caress. Bastian felt the phantom itch of his phone in his pocket. the urge to scroll through a feed to kill the stillness, but he forced his hands to remain flat on the table. From the periphery, blending into the shadows of the glazed shelves, Eiko Tanaka stood perfectly still. She held her head at a slight, knowing tilt, her eyes tracking the arc of the brush. She looked less like a guest and more like a permanent fixture of the studio, an observer who had already seen the ending of the story. "Stop thinking about the clock, Bastian," Lorenzo said, his voice a low rumble like gravel sliding over silk. He didn't break the rhythm. The clay does not care what time it is in Florence, it only knows the pressure of the hand. Now, take the brush. Synchronize your breath with the motion. Inhale on the lift, exhale on the sweep. Bastian picked up the second brush, the bristles feeling flimsy in his grip. He mirrored his grandfather's position over a shard of the cobalt bowl. He tried to breathe as instructed, but his lungs felt tight. He swept the brush across the ceramic, but the sound was wrong. A series of jerky scratching noises, scritch, shush, scritch, scritch. He was pushing too hard, treating the dust as an enemy to be eradicated. To Bastian, this was a tedious prerequisite before the actual work of gold and lacquer began. "You are cleaning the clay, Bastian, but you are not cleaning the mind," Eiko said, her voice arriving from the shadows without the sound of a footstep. Bastian stopped mid-sweep. He looked over his shoulder, a flash of irritation prickling his skin. "I don't understand. It's just dust. If I clean it faster, we can actually start the repair." "The speed is the noise," Eiko replied, her expression unreadable. "When you rush, you tell the object that you cannot wait for it. You treat the bowl as a problem to be solved, not a history to be honored. The mind that rushes the cleaning will rush the mending, and the gold will only hide a fracture that hasn't been truly understood." Bastian sighed, a sharp sound in the meditative space. He turned back to the shard, feeling the weight of the secret he had hidden, the intruder shard with the frantic handwriting pressing against his consciousness. He shifted his weight, fingers tapping a rapid rhythm on the workbench. He wanted the clarity of a finished product. Eiko's philosophy felt like a wall he couldn't climb. As he resumed, he noticed something. Underneath a crust of gray grime, a flash of color emerged. He leaned in until his nose was inches from the clay. He swept the brush more slowly, and a deep, unexpected crimson glaze bled through the gray. It wasn't the cobalt blue of the rest of the bowl, but a rich, arterial red, concentrated in a swirling vein like a frozen current of lava. "Look here," Bastian whispered. "There's red under the blue." Lorenzo paused and leaned over. He didn't look surprised. He reached out and placed his hand over Bastian's, guiding the grip. "You are gripping it like a hammer. Feel the difference." Lorenzo applied firm pressure, and the bristles splayed with a harsh grating sound. Then he lightened the touch, the brush barely skimming the surface. "Too firm, and you scratch the soul of the glaze," Lorenzo murmured. "Too light, and you ignore the dirt. The truth is in the middle. The red you see is a hidden fire." The potter played a game with the kiln, layering glazes to surprise whoever eventually broke it. Bastian felt a shift in his chest, the rhythmic shh, as he focused on the crimson vein, the internal noise of the city, the imagined pings of emails, and the restlessness of Florence began to recede. The studio narrowed to the tip of the brush and the breath in his lungs. For a few minutes the vacuum of focus was absolute. He stopped tapping his thigh. He simply existed in the space between the inhale and the sweep. It was a fragile piece. He found himself wondering about the person who had layered that red glaze, the intent behind the secret color. The mystery of the bowl was beginning to outweigh the desire to finish it. Just as Bastian captured the rhythm, Eiko stepped forward, materializing from the air. She didn't look at the crimson glaze. Instead, her gaze drifted to the wreckage spread across the table, scanning the gaps with surgical precision. "The rhythm is returning to your hands," Eiko observed, "but your eyes are still lying to you." Bastian froze. A cold spike of anxiety hit him. He wondered if she had seen him slide the 4-inch shard toward the edge of the table, or if she had noticed how he had shielded it with his forearm. "Why?" Eiko asked, her voice tilting upward. "Are you ignoring the piece that is missing entirely? You clean the fragments you have, but you do not acknowledge the void where the rest should be." Bastian looked down at the ruins. The gap was there, a jagged absence that felt like a physical ache. He thought of the intruder shard hidden under his arm, the piece that didn't belong, the piece with the frantic writing. He realized with a jolt that Eiko wasn't talking about the missing sliver he had lost. She was talking about the piece he had found and chosen to hide. The silence in the studio returned, but it was no longer somnolent. It was heavy with the weight of a secret that was beginning to breathe. The viscous flow. The brush resisted him. It wasn't the resistance of the tool against a surface, but the stubbornness of the material itself. The urushi lacquer clung to the bristles with an agonizing, honey-like slowness, pulling away in thick, viscous strings that seemed to fight the very idea of movement. Bastian stared at the bead of adhesive, his breath hitching. In Florence, everything flowed pixel-shifted with a flick of a wrist. Emails flew across the globe in milliseconds, and the city moved in a blur of high-speed transit. Here, in the heavy heat of the Tuscan afternoon, time had thickened into a syrup. He tried to draw a thin, precise line along the jagged edge of a cobalt shard, but the lacquer pooled, bulging in a way that felt clumsy and wrong. He felt the familiar itch in his thigh, the ghost of a rhythmic tap that he was trying to suppress. The scent of the studio was a clash of worlds, the pungent chemical tang of the adhesive, sharp and medicinal, warring with the drift of wild rosemary blowing in through the open window. The rosemary smelled of sun-baked earth and ancient dust, a scent that felt like it belonged to the hills, while the lacquer smelled of a laboratory. He shifted his weight, his palms damp. He wanted to push the material, to force it into the line he had envisioned, but he remembered Lorenzo's warning. The lacquer was not a medium to be commanded, it was a partner to be negotiated with. A humming melody drifted into the room before the person did. It was a soft, undulating sound, a gentle cadence that seemed to smooth the jagged edges of the studio's tension. Chiara entered carrying a woven basket of fresh herbs, her presence acting as a cooling balm against the oppressive humidity. She didn't speak immediately, instead moving through the space with a slow, rhythmic grace that mirrored the rolling hills visible through the window. She set the basket on a side table, the fragrance of crushed mint and sage momentarily masking the chemical bite of the urushi. "You are fighting the flow, Bastian," Chiara said, her voice a melodic hum that felt as though it were vibrating in the air. She stepped closer, her eyes tracking the movement of his hand. She didn't reach for the piece, but her proximity felt like a gentle pressure. She tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, a slow, deliberate motion that seemed to signal a shift in the room's energy. "The lacquer is like the valley. It does not care for your deadlines. It takes the time it needs to settle, and if you rush it, it will only remember the haste in your hands." Bastian looked at the glob of adhesive on the ceramic. It looked like a mistake, a clumsy blotch on a masterpiece of cobalt. "I just want it to be clean," he whispered, his voice sounding thin and youthful compared to the grounded weight of the room. "If the line isn't perfect, the whole thing is compromised. I can see where it's going wrong, but I can't make it move faster." "Precision is not speed," Chiara replied, her tone lacking any edge of judgment. "You are looking for the finish line, but the lacquer only cares about the present moment. If you fight it, you are not practicing kintsugi, you are merely gluing a pot." As the afternoon heat peaked, a strange, heavy trance began to settle over him. The sunlight hitting the dusty floorboards created shimmering patterns that seemed to pulse in time with his own heartbeat. The world narrowed down to the tip of the brush and the viscous, golden-brown liquid. He felt his focus slipping, the mental noise of the city returning as a distant, humming static. His hand wavered. For a second, the stability he had fought for vanished, and he nearly left a heavy glob of adhesive where a hair-thin line should have been. He jerked back, his breath coming in a sharp, jagged gasp, his heart skipping a beat as he stared at the near catastrophe. He looked over at Lorenzo, who was sitting in the corner, his thumb rubbing against his index finger in that eternal, tactile rhythm. Lorenzo wasn't watching him with a critical eye, but rather with a patient, expectant stillness. Bastian realized then that the stakes had shifted. This wasn't about the frustration of a slow process anymore. It was about the structural integrity of the repair. If the lacquer was too thick, the gold powder applied later would not sit flat. It would be lumpy, uneven, a scar that shouted rather than whispered. The gold would be ruined by his impatience. Bastian closed his eyes. He forced himself to listen to the silence of the studio, the distant chime of a church bell in the village, and the slow, steady rhythm of Lorenzo's breathing. He imagined the lacquer not as a stubborn glue, but as a river, slow and deep. He waited until the tension in his shoulders dissolved, until the urge to tap his thigh subsided into a dull, manageable hum. When he opened his eyes, the light in the room had shifted to a deeper amber, casting long, skeletal shadows across the workbench. He dipped the brush again, but this time he didn't push. He allowed the lacquer to cling, waited for the precise moment of release, and swept the brush in a single, fluid motion. The line was thin, shimmering, and true. It was a small victory, but it felt like a mountain climbed. He felt a surge of quiet pride, a sense of presence that he hadn't experienced since arriving in Tuscany. He was no longer thinking about the digital noise of Florence or the emails waiting in his inbox. He was simply a man with a brush and a broken bowl. With a steady hand, he picked up the first 2 shards. He aligned them with a delicacy that felt almost prayer-like, pressing the edges together. He felt the resistance of the ceramic, the slight grit of the surfaces meeting. He held them there, applying a constant, gentle pressure, allowing the lacquer to bond the fracture. He felt the weight of the secret shard, the one with the frantic handwriting, pressing against him in his pocket, a cold contrast to the warmth of the studio. He wondered if the lacquer he was using now could ever mend the kind of break that the intruder shard represented. As he slowly eased the pressure and stepped back to inspect the join, his brow furrowed. From the seam where the 2 cobalt pieces met, a strange dark residue was beginning to leak. It wasn't the golden brown of the urushi, nor was it the cobalt of the glaze. It was a deep, visceral crimson, thick and slow-moving, seeping out from the interior of the ceramic like a slow bleed. It looked like old blood, ancient and dried, yet somehow still fluid, weeping from a wound that should have been closed a century ago. Bastian recoiled, his chair scraping harshly against the stone floor. He stared at the dark stain, the sight of it triggering a sudden, inexplicable chill that raced through his veins. The meditative peace of the afternoon shattered. He studied the residue, then at the hidden shard in his pocket, and finally at Lorenzo. The old man had stopped rubbing his fingers. He was staring at the crimson leak with an expression that wasn't surprise, but a grim, knowing recognition. The echo of cicadas. Lorenzo didn't move to wipe away the crimson leak. He simply watched it, his thumb continuing that slow, rhythmic friction against his index finger, as if he were reading the viscosity of the fluid. The silence in the studio thickened, turning heavy and humid, smelling of damp earth and the sharp, sharp tang of the residue. Bastian felt the weight of the secret shard in his pocket, a hard, jagged pressure against his thigh, and for a moment he wondered if the crimson liquid was a physical manifestation of the lie he was holding. He wanted to speak, to ask what the hell was happening, but the air felt too dense to push through. "It is a memory of the earth," Lorenzo said, his voice a low, raspy gravel that seemed to vibrate through the stone floor. He didn't look up. Some things are broken so deeply that they hold on to the ghost of what they once contained. This bowl, it was not always a vessel for tea. Bastian shifted his weight, his chair creaking. He studied the crimson stain, then at the open window, where the Tuscan heat shimmered in waves. Outside, the cicadas had begun their afternoon crescendo, a wall of sound that felt less like noise and more like a physical vibration pressing against the walls of the studio. The heat was oppressive, the kind of gold-heavy air that turned limbs to lead and thoughts to syrup. As the minutes stretched, the initial shock of the crimson bleed began to fade into a strange collective drowsiness. The tension didn't vanish, but it softened, curving into the somnolent rhythm of the valley. Lorenzo leaned back, his spine settling into the worn wood of his chair. 50 years ago, he began, the narrative drifting like smoke. There was a storm that did not just bring rain, but a kind of anger. The wind came off the peaks with a scream that ripped the shutters from the villa. I was a young man then, full of the arrogance of those who believe they can control the clay. Bastian found himself leaning back, his eyes half closing. The rhythmic drone of the cicadas outside merged with the cadence of his grandfather's voice. He felt his heart rate slowing, the frantic digital pulse of his life in Florence, the notifications, the deadlines, the constant, buzzing urgency, receding like a tide. He wasn't thinking about the phone in his bag or the emails stacking up in a virtual void. He was simply a body in a room, suspended in a story that felt as old as the olive groves surrounding the house. "I had a piece then," Lorenzo continued, his voice dipping into a meditative hum. "A great vase, cobalt and gold, the finest thing I had ever coaxed from the wheel. I spent 3 months on the glaze alone, obsessing over a shade of blue that looked like the ocean at midnight. I kept it in the shed, prideful and foolish, thinking it was the center of my world. When the storm hit, the roof of the shed didn't just leak, it surrendered. A beam snapped, a heavy timber falling straight through the center of that vase. Bastian could almost see it, the heavy, salt-gray beam crashing through the delicate blue ceramic. He felt a sympathetic ache in his own chest, a phantom fracture. He watched Lorenzo's weathered hands, the skin mapped with fine lines and permanent stains of oxide, and realized he was no longer tapping his thigh. His hands were open, resting palms up on the workbench, mirroring the stillness of the room. "I remember standing over the shards," Lorenzo said, his voice slowing, stretching out the vowels. "I wept. I truly believed that my life had been diminished because the object was gone. I saw the break as a tragedy, a void that could never be filled. But as I sat there in the mud and the ruins of my shed, I realized something. The vase was gone, yes, but the knowledge of how to make it remained in my fingers. The loss was the only thing that could have taught me that nothing is permanent. The beauty wasn't in the vase. The beauty was in the capacity to lose it and still breathe. The narrative began to loop, drifting into the sensory details of that distant afternoon, the smell of static crackle, the sight of crushed nightbloom scent petals plastered against the wet stone. Bastian felt the line between the present and the past blurring. He was no longer just listening. He was drifting through the memory with his grandfather. The heavy air of the studio seemed to suspend them both in a golden amber, a moment of shared existence where the secret shard in Bastian's pocket felt less like a weapon and more like a curiosity, a small piece of a larger, slower puzzle. He noticed his breathing had changed. He wasn't taking the shallow, jagged breaths of a city dweller in a hurry. He was inhaling slowly, deeply, his chest expanding in a wide, rhythmic arc. He glanced at Lorenzo and realized with a start that they were breathing in perfect unison. It was a synchronicity that felt more intimate than a conversation, a biological alignment, a grandfather and grandson sharing the same air, the same tempo, the same stillness. Lorenzo paused. He stopped rubbing his fingers and turned his head, looking at Bastian. His gaze was heavy, a mixture of profound pride and a mourning that Bastian couldn't quite name. It was the look of a man who saw the ghost of his younger self in the eyes of the boy and knew exactly how much the boy still had to break before he could be mended. "You have the hands of a maker, Bastian," Lorenzo whispered, the sound barely audible over the cicadas. "But you have the heart of a runner. You must learn that the most important part of the journey is the part where you stop." Bastian opened his mouth to respond, perhaps to apologize for the shard, or perhaps to ask about the crimson leak, but the words stayed trapped in his throat, unnecessary in the face of such quietude. He felt a strange, shimmering peace, a sense that for the first time in years he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The world had shrunk to the size of this studio, the smell of urushi and old stone, and the steady, comforting presence of the old man. That peace was shattered by a sudden, violent crash from the other side of the studio. It was the sound of heavy ceramic meeting, a hard floor, a cacophony of splintering clay and sliding shards that ripped through the trance like a blade through silk. Bastian jolted upright, his chair screeching against the stone, the sudden movement sending a jolt of adrenaline through his system. His heart hammered against his ribs, the meditative silence replaced by a sharp, ringing void. He looked toward the source of the noise, where a shelf of drying bisqueware had collapsed, sending a dozen pieces shattering across the floor in a spray of white dust. Amidst the wreckage, something caught the light, a flash of deep, visceral crimson, identical to the leak in the bowl, pooling slowly around the broken remains. Infusion. Chiara didn't ask what had happened to the bisqueware shelf. She simply arrived with a heavy ceramic pot of tea, the steam rising in thick, swirling plumes that smelled of crushed mint and lemon balm. The scent cut through the alkaline dust of the shattered clay, a sudden green intrusion into the sterile wreckage. She moved with a slow, humming grace, pouring the infusion into mismatched cups. The liquid was a pale, translucent amber, shimmering under the studio skylights. She set a cup before Bastian, the porcelain warm enough to seep through the skin of his palms. He gripped the vessel with both hands, the heat forcing him to take slow, mindful sips to avoid burning his tongue, the liquid searing a path down his throat that felt like a cleansing fire. Lorenzo remained by the wreckage, his thumb rubbing against his index finger in a rhythmic, unconscious loop. He wasn't looking at the broken pieces so much as he was listening to the silence they left behind. Bastian watched him, then looked back at the crimson fluid that had pooled on the floor. It hadn't dried, it remained visceral, a wet, vivid wound in the center of the room. The contrast between the soothing scent of Chiara's tea and the sight of that blood-colored glaze created a jarring dissonance in Bastian's chest. He felt the secret shard in his pocket, the one with the frantic script press against his thigh, a cold weight that refused to be ignored. Beside him, Ismael had undergone a quiet transformation. The ruler, which he had carried like a talisman of order since his arrival, lay forgotten on a side table. Instead, he held a leather-bound notebook, his charcoal pencil scratching against the heavy paper. He wasn't drawing blueprints or calculating angles. He was sketching the organic, jagged flow of the cracks in the shattered bisqueware, capturing the way the clay had surrendered to gravity. His lines were loose, almost erratic, mirroring the chaos of the collapse. He didn't look up when Bastian glanced at him, but his shoulders had dropped an inch, the rigid tension of his posture finally snapping. I spent 3 years in Dubai designing a tower that didn't lean by a single millimeter, Ismail said, his voice a softened whisper that barely carried over the sound of the wind in the olive trees. He didn't stop sketching. I thought if I could just eliminate the margin of error, I could eliminate the fear. The symmetry was a shield, Bastian. I believed that if the lines were perfect, the life behind them would be too. He paused, the pencil hovering over a particularly violent splinter of clay. But the tower is finished, and I am still terrified of the wind. Chiara tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, her gaze drifting toward the open doors of the studio. Beyond the stone walls, the rolling Tuscan hills were bathed in a late afternoon gold, the silver-green leaves of the olive groves shimmering. The wind is what makes them strong, she said, her voice melodic and humming. My father used to take me into the groves after the summer storms. He would show me the trees that had been split by lightning, the ones with the blackened scars running deep into the heartwood. He told me that the trees which have survived the most strikes often produce the most potent oil. They have to reach deeper into the earth to find the strength to stay standing. The struggle doesn't ruin the fruit, it concentrates it. Bastian felt a sudden, sharp prick of recognition. He thought of the burnout that had driven him from Florence, the way the digital noise of his career had eventually become a deafening roar that left him unable to sleep, unable to breathe. He had viewed that collapse as a failure, a break in his own internal symmetry. But as he studied the crimson glaze pooling on the floor, he wondered if that break was actually a revelation. The crimson wasn't a flaw in the clay, it was something hidden beneath the surface, revealed only through destruction. His own burnout was the crimson leak, the visceral, honest part of himself that had been buried under layers of professional polish and city expectations. The Japanese call it wabi-sabi, Aiko intervened, her voice airy and precise. She had been standing in the shadows of the kiln, observing the group with a slight, knowing tilt of her head. She stepped forward, her movements as fluid as the tea in the cups. It is the beauty of things, imperfect, impermanent, and incomplete. We spend our lives trying to reach a state of wholeness, but wholeness is a stagnant thing. It is the gap, the crack, the missing piece that allows for growth. A bowl that has never been broken is merely a tool. A bowl that has been broken and mended with gold is a story. Bastian took another sip of the tea. The heat was now mirroring the warmth of the studio, the scent of mint and lemon balm weaving together with the earthy smell of wet clay and old stone. For a moment, the room felt like a cocoon of communal safety. The tension between him and Ismail had evaporated, replaced by a shared vulnerability. He felt an impulse to reach into his pocket and pull out the secret shard, to show them the frantic handwriting and ask what it meant, to let the secret be part of the collective mending. He wanted to be honest, to stop running, to let the others see the jagged edges of his own curiosity. But as the tea cooled, the silence of the studio shifted. Bastian's gaze drifted back to the main project, the large bowl they had been working on, the one Lorenzo had spent weeks guiding him through. It sat on the workbench, partially assembled, the gold lacquer seams shimmering. As he leaned in, his heart gave a strange, uneven thud. One of the joined pieces had shifted. A gap had opened where there should have been a seamless bond, a thin, dark sliver of space that hadn't been there an hour ago. It was a microscopic failure, a betrayal of the adhesive, but in the stillness of the room, it looked like a canyon. He stared at the gap, the feeling of peace receding as quickly as it had arrived. The shift was subtle, but it felt intentional, as if the bowl were rejecting the repair. He thought of the crimson fluid on the floor and the shard in his pocket, and he realized that the wreckage of the bisqueware shelf wasn't an accident of gravity. The house, the studio, and the objects within it seemed to be reacting to something. The gap in the bowl wasn't just a technical error, it was an invitation. He reached out a finger to touch the edge of the fracture, but before he could, a sudden draft swept through the studio, extinguishing the small incense burner by the door and leaving them in a sudden cooling dimness. The gold in the seams no longer shimmered. It looked like a scar that refused to heal. The patience of dust. Bastian's fingertips hovered a fraction of an inch above the gold lacquer seam, his hand trembling with a microscopic, electric hunger. The gap in the bowl, that thin, dark sliver of failure, felt like a challenge, a jagged riddle that demanded a solution. He wanted to press his thumb into the void, to force the adhesive back into place, to erase the mistake before the lacquer set into a permanent record of incompetence. His fingers twitched, the rhythm of his tapping moving from his thigh to the air, a frantic staccato that mirrored the humming anxiety in his chest. Lorenzo didn't move, but his presence shifted. He stepped into Bastian's peripheral vision, not with a gesture of alarm, but as a silent sentinel. He didn't tell him to stop, he simply existed in the space between Bastian and the bowl, a living wall of weathered skin and linen. The old man's thumb rubbed against his index finger, a slow, rhythmic friction that seemed to pull the frantic energy out of the air. He looked not at the bowl, but at his grandson's shaking hand, his gaze heavy with a patience that felt almost oppressive. "The lacquer is not a glue, Bastian," Lorenzo said, his voice a low, raspy slide of gravel over silk. "It is a living thing. If you fight it now, you only teach it how to break." Bastian pulled his hand back, but the urge remained, a physical itch beneath his skin. He looked around the studio, seeking a distraction, but the room had fallen into a heavy, expectant hush. The smell of damp earth and the sharp tang of gold powder lingered in the air, thick and cloying. On the terracotta floor, a single shaft of Tuscan sunlight had landed in a bright, sharp rectangle. As the minutes bled into an hour, Bastian watched that rectangle crawl across the floor with agonizing slowness, an inch of light moving toward a smudge of dried crimson glaze that still stained the tile. The movement was so glacial, it felt like a taunt. In the city, an hour was a dozen emails, 3 coffees, a commute of focused aggression. Here, an hour was merely the distance between 2 floor tiles. Ismael had been quiet for a long time. He sat at the drafting table, his sketchbook open, a charcoal pencil poised over a series of perfectly symmetrical diagrams. He had spent the last hour attempting to map the fracture of the bowl, trying to calculate a geometric ideal that would override the organic chaos of the break. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes darting between the bowl and the paper, his brow furrowed in a struggle for dominance over the material. Suddenly, the pencil stopped. Ismael stared at the drawing, a masterpiece of precision, a blueprint for a bowl that had never existed and could never be. He watched the actual object on the workbench, with its uneven seams and the stubborn, dark gap that refused to be ignored. He let out a breath that sounded like a surrender. With a slow, deliberate motion, he closed the sketchbook. The snap of the cover echoed in the stillness. "It is an exercise in futility," Ismael said, his voice formal but stripped of its usual sharpness. He didn't look up. "I was trying to design a ghost. If I make it symmetrical, if I erase the evidence of the fall, I am not repairing the bowl. I am merely pretending it never broke. The soul of the object isn't in the gold, but in the fact that it survived the shatter." Bastian felt a strange shift in the room's gravity. The tension didn't vanish, but it changed shape, transforming from a contest of wills into a shared weight. He leaned back against the workbench, his muscles aching from the effort of remaining still. The silence of the studio, which had previously felt like an awkward gap he needed to fill with action, began to feel like a garment that finally fit. He watched a spider navigate the underside of a drawing rack, its movements precise and unhurried. He realized he was fighting the air itself, treating the weight as a void to be crossed rather than a space to be inhabited. Lorenzo moved closer, his footsteps soft on the terracotta. He didn't look at the bowl now, he studied Bastian. "You think the work happens when you are moving," the old man murmured. "You think the gold is the repair. But the gold is just a scar. The real repair happens now, in the drying, in the stillness. The lacquer cures in the humidity and the heat, yes, but the artist cures in the waiting. If you cannot sit with the brokenness of the thing, without trying to force it whole, you will never understand why we use gold in the first place." Bastian closed his eyes. He thought of the secret shard in his pocket, the frantic handwriting he was still hiding, the lie that sat like a stone in his gut. The urge to rush, to solve, to uncover, and to fix was a noise that had followed him from Florence, a digital hum that had rewritten his internal clock. He felt the weight of the weight pressing down on his shoulders, a physical gravity that demanded he surrender. He took a breath, long and slow, feeling the cool air settle in his lungs. He consciously relaxed his fingers, letting them unfurl and drop to his sides. He exhaled a long, shuddering breath, a sound of total collapse, and for the first time since he had arrived in Tuscany, he accepted the void. He stopped trying to bridge the gap. For a long while, the 3 men remained in the dimming light, the only sound the distant chime of a church bell in the valley and the rhythmic rub of Lorenzo's fingers. The studio had become a sanctuary of shared patience. The air felt lighter, the shadows stretching long and thin across the room, painting the walls in shades of bruised purple and gold. Bastian felt a strange kinship with Ismael, a mutual recognition of the exhaustion that comes from chasing perfection. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the studio into a soft amber gloom, The light hit the bowl at a sharp, final angle. Lorenzo stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. He didn't touch the piece, but he leaned in, his weathered face inches from the gold seam. "Look," Lorenzo whispered. Bastian leaned in. There, running perpendicular to the gold-filled fracture, was a new line. It was a hairline fracture, so thin it was almost invisible, a ghost of a crack beginning to spiderweb through the fresh adhesive. The piece wasn't settling, it was straining. The tension that had been held in the clay for decades was fighting the repair, a slow-motion rebellion of the material. The bowl was beginning to split again, not along the old lines, but through the very heart of the mend. Bastian felt the cold return to his fingertips. The piece he had just found was fragile, a thin glaze over a deeper instability. He reached instinctively for the pocket containing the secret shard, wondering if the handwriting on that piece of clay had warned of this, or if the bowl was simply rejecting the touch of those who didn't yet know how to truly let go. Withering line. The jar was small, a heavy ceramic vessel with a lid that resisted for a heartbeat before yielding with a dry, vacuum-sealed pop. Inside, the gold powder lay in a shimmering, concentrated heap, a yellow so intense it felt predatory. Bastian held the jar with a grip that bordered on desperation, his knuckles white. He could feel the secret shard in his pocket, the one with the jagged handwriting, pressing against his thigh like a hot coal. The hairline fracture Lorenzo had spotted in the dimming light of the previous evening had not vanished. It had remained a silent threat, a ghost in the clay that whispered of inevitable collapse. "Steady," Lorenzo said, his voice a low rasp that barely carried across the workbench. He didn't move to help. He didn't even lean in. He stood a full arm's length away, his hands tucked into the pockets of his apron, his thumb likely tracing the familiar texture of his own skin. The distance was a vacuum, a sudden void of authority that left Bastian feeling exposed. For the first time, the weight of the project wasn't shared, it was a solitary inheritance. Bastian reached for the fine-tipped brush, his movements jerky. He dipped the bristles into the gold, barely skimming the surface. He needed only a pinch, a dusting of light to bridge the dark lacquer. But as he lifted the brush, a sudden, rogue draft swept through the open studio window. It wasn't a gust, but a sharp, focused needle of air that caught the gold powder exactly as it left the jar. A cloud of metal-sharp dust erupted, a shimmering nebula that swirled upward in a chaotic spiral, threatening to coat the entire workbench, the bowl, and Bastian's own trembling hands in a layer of indiscriminate glitter. Bastian froze. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. He became a statue of held tension, his lungs burning as he watched the gold dance in the air. The world narrowed down to that floating cloud. He could hear the distant, rhythmic thrum of a cicada in the olive groves and the soft, rhythmic click of Ismail's glasses being adjusted nearby. If the powder landed on the wrong parts of the bowl, the repair would be ruined, not by a crack, but by a smudge, a lack of intention. He felt a sudden, sharp heat behind his eyes, a surge of panic that tasted like metal tang. He waited for the air to settle, his body rigid, praying for the wind to die as quickly as it had arrived. Slowly, the gold drifted down, settling in a fine, glittering mist over the dark wooden table. The bowl remained mostly clear, though a few stray grains clung to the rim. Bastian exhaled a long, shuddering breath, his shoulders dropping an inch. He fixed on Lorenzo, expecting a critique or a sigh of disappointment. Instead, his grandfather remained in the periphery, his eyes soft, his presence a supportive shadow. He had stepped out of the circle of action, leaving the final, most perilous touch entirely to the boy who had spent the last month trying to outrun time. Bastian turned back to the piece. He dipped the brush again, this time with a deliberation that felt like a prayer. He approached the first dark line of lacquer, the scar that had once been a violent break. As the brush touched the surface, the gold powder adhered instantly. The first glint appeared, a sudden, electric strike of light that sliced through the amber gloom of the studio. It was a transformation so abrupt it felt visceral. The gold didn't just cover the crack, it illuminated it, turning a point of failure into a vein of nobility. He moved the brush with a fluid, sweeping motion he hadn't known he possessed. The rhythmic tapping of his fingers against his thigh, the nervous tick that had been his constant companion since Florence, had vanished. In its place was a strange, heavy silence. He felt the pressure of Lorenzo's trust, a gravity more significant than the humid Tuscan heat pressing against the walls. It was a weight that didn't crush, but anchored him. He wasn't just fixing a bowl, he was tracing the map of his grandfather's patience, filling the voids of his own restlessness with something permanent. As he worked, the bowl began to glow. The gold filled the fractures, winding around the curves of the ceramic like a river of light. The piece looked stronger now, not because the clay had healed, but because the repair was honest. The scars were no longer things to be hidden or smoothed over. They were the most valuable parts of the object. Bastian felt a mirroring sensation in his own chest, a loosening of the knot that had tightened every time he considered the life he had left behind in the city. The digital hum of his previous existence felt distant, a fading frequency replaced by the tactile reality of brush hairs and mineral dust. He reached the section where the new hairline fracture had appeared. He hesitated, the brush hovering a millimeter above the surface. He remembered the secret shard in his pocket and the handwriting that felt like a riddle he wasn't yet equipped to solve. He wondered if the gold would mask the instability, or if it would highlight the flaw. He pressed the brush down, carefully filling the thin, ghostly line. The gold flowed into the gap, sealing the rebellion of the material with a shimmering truce. As he applied the final touch to the base of the bowl, the angle of the afternoon sun shifted, sending a sharp beam of light directly into a small, gold-filled gap near the foot of the piece. Bastian paused. He leaned in, his nose nearly touching the cool ceramic. There, etched into the clay beneath the gold, hidden for decades and only now revealed by the way the powder had settled, was a symbol. It was a small, stylized bird, a swallow in mid-flight, carved with a precision that spoke of a different hand than the one that had made the bowl. He pulled back, his heart skipping. He watched the symbol, then at the secret shard in his pocket, then at Lorenzo. His grandfather was still standing back, watching him with an expression that was neither surprise nor confirmation, but a quiet, expectant waiting. The gold had not just repaired the vessel, it had acted as a key, unlocking a detail that had been invisible to the naked eye. The bowl was no longer just a lesson in kintsugi, it was a document. Bastian felt the sudden urge to speak, to demand an explanation, to pull the hidden shard from his pocket and slam it onto the table. But the stillness of the studio held him. He studied the shimmering gold veins, then at the small, carved bird. The silence between him and Lorenzo stretched, no longer a void, but a bridge. He realized that the repair was finished, but the story, the real, fragmented story of the Moretti family, had only just begun to be told. He didn't move, fearing that any sudden action would break the fragile equilibrium of the moment, leaving him staring at a gold-lined secret he wasn't sure he was ready to uncover. The collective exhale. The bull sat on the scarred oak workbench, a small, shimmering island in a sea of gray dust and dried lacquer. The gold veins didn't just bridge the gaps, they seemed to pulse, catching the late afternoon light that filtered through the high, salt-streaked windows of the studio. Bastian stood frozen, the secret shard still a cold, hard weight against his thigh in his pocket, while the others drifted inward. They formed a loose circle, their shadows stretching long and thin across the concrete floor, converging on the object like pilgrims around a relic. For a long time, no one spoke. The silence wasn't the empty kind Bastian had known in Florence, the sterile silence of noise-canceling headphones or the dead air of a crashed server. This was a heavy, living silence, a collective exhale that seemed to pull the very oxygen from the room. It felt as though they were all holding a single, fragile breath, terrified that a sudden word might shatter the ceramic once again. Bastian watched the way the light played off the gold, the swallow symbol glinting with a quiet, stubborn insistence. He felt the heat of the other bodies around him, the scent of linseed oil and old earth clinging to their clothes, and for the first time in years, the frantic ticking clock in his head had simply stopped. Aiko stepped forward, her movements as fluid and economical as a brushstroke on rice paper. She didn't touch the piece. Instead, she tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly as she traced the trajectory of the gold. The angle of her chin was a precise measurement of appreciation. "It is a conversation," Aiko said, her voice an airy, rhythmic cadence that barely disturbed the stillness. "The discipline of the East has met the warmth of the Tuscan clay. It is no longer a Japanese repair or an Italian vessel. It has become a hybrid, a third thing entirely. The gold does not hide the trauma, it honors the survival." Bastian shifted his weight, his fingers twitching toward the pocket where the hidden shard lay. He felt a sudden sharp spike of guilt, a dissonance between the harmony Aiko described and the lie he was carrying. He watched the bowl, then at his grandfather. Lorenzo was standing perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the gold lines with an intensity that felt almost physical. He wasn't looking at the technical success of the join, he was looking at the map of the break. Ismail leaned in, his glasses slipping slightly down the bridge of his nose. He didn't push them back up. He remained bent over the bowl, his architectural mind likely calculating the stress points and the load-bearing capacity of the lacquer. For weeks, Ismael had spoken of symmetry and the mathematical purity of a perfect circle. Now he remained silent for a full minute, his eyes tracking a particularly jagged vein of gold that veered sharply to the left before curving back. "I spent my life trying to eliminate the deviation," Ismael murmured, his formal tone softening into something closer to a confession. "I thought the line had to be straight to be true. But look at this. The irregularity is the only thing giving the piece structural honesty. It is the true architecture of the object, not the shape it started with, but the shape it chose to become after the fall." Chiara let out a soft, melodic hum, a sound that vibrated in the back of her throat like a distant bee. She had been standing on the periphery, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She smiled, a slow, genuine expression that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "It looks like it belongs to the valley now," Chiara said, her voice lilted and warm. "It has the look of the hills after a storm, broken in places, yes, but stronger for the rain. It doesn't look like a museum piece. It looks like something a family would use for 100 years. She tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, her gaze drifting toward the open door where the scent of wild rosemary and sun-baked stone drifted in on a lazy breeze. Bastian felt a strange sensation in his chest, a loosening of a knot he hadn't realized he'd been tying since he left the city. He studied his own hands, stained with pigment, the skin dry and smelling of minerals. He realized that the frantic, cluttered noise of his mind had subsided. The digital ghost of his former life, the endless notifications and the pressure of 1,000 simultaneous deadlines, felt like a dream he had woken from. He wasn't thinking about the next step or the final result. He was simply there, occupying the space between the workbench and the window. He looked up and found Lorenzo watching him. His grandfather's eyes weren't those of a teacher evaluating a student's progress. There was no critique in them, no hidden correction. Instead, there was a reflection of the gold from the bowl, a shimmering recognition. Lorenzo looked at him as a peer, a fellow traveler who had survived the process of breaking and mending. For a moment, the gap between the retired potter and the disillusioned designer vanished, replaced by a shared understanding of what it meant to hold something fragile in one's hands. They stood there in the thickening amber light, the circle unbroken. The only sound was the distant, fading drone of the cicadas in the olive groves, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to sync with the breathing of the room. The studio felt like a sanctuary, a place where time had slowed to the speed of drying lacquer. Bastian felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to be honest, to pull the shard from his pocket and lay it on the table, to ask about the swallow and the handwriting. He felt that the air was finally clear enough to support the weight of the truth. But as he began to move, the equilibrium shifted. Lorenzo reached out. It was a simple gesture, an intention to move the bowl to the drying shelf to protect it from the evening damp. But as his hand entered the light, the stability vanished. A violent tremor seized his wrist, a sudden, uncontrolled shudder that ripped through his arm. His fingers, usually so deliberate and rhythmic, spasmed. The bowl tilted. Time seemed to stretch, the motion happening in slow, agonizing frames. The masterpiece, the hybrid of two worlds, teetered on the edge of the oak workbench. The gold veins flashed one last time under the studio lights as the bowl began its descent toward the hard, unforgiving concrete floor. Bastian lunged forward, his heart leaping into his throat, but he was a second too slow, the distance between them too great to bridge in a single heartbeat. The twilight descent. The bowl didn't shatter with a crash. It made a wet, clinical sound, like a heavy stone dropped into thick mud. For a moment, the silence that followed was more violent than the impact. Bastian stayed frozen in his lunge, his fingertips inches from the concrete, his breath hitching in a throat that felt tight and dry. He didn't look at the shards first. He studied Lorenzo. His grandfather's arm was still extended, the wrist vibrating with a residual electric shudder that seemed to echo through the entire room. Lorenzo wasn't looking at the floor. He was staring at his own hand with a look of profound betrayal, as if his body had suddenly become a stranger speaking a language he couldn't translate. Aiko was the first to move. She didn't gasp or cry out. She simply stepped forward and placed a hand on Lorenzo's shoulder, her touch light but grounding. She didn't offer a platitude or a correction. She just stood there, a quiet anchor in the wake of the collapse. Bastian finally looked down. The bowl, the one they had spent days cleaning, aligning, and bonding with gold, had returned to its original state, a constellation of jagged cobalt fragments scattered across the gray floor. The gold veins, those shimmering lines of resilience they had so carefully painted, were now severed, the lacquer still tacky in some places, clinging to the dust of the studio. "It is only a different kind of broken now," Aiko said, her voice airy and precise, though it carried a weight of solemnity. Bastian felt a surge of something hot and erratic in his chest. It wasn't anger, but a frantic sort of grief. He sank to his knees, his palms pressing against the cool concrete. He began to gather the pieces, his movements hurried and clumsy. He wanted to fix it instantly, to reverse the last 10 seconds, to glue the world back together before the tragedy became permanent. As he reached for a larger curve of the rim, his hand brushed against the fabric of his own pocket. The secret shard, the one with the jagged handwriting, pressed against his thigh. The contrast was visceral. The bowl on the floor was a public failure, a shared loss, while the shard in his pocket remained a private, hidden truth. He felt the weight of it like a lead sinker, pulling him down into the dirt. Lorenzo finally spoke, his voice a low, raspy gravel that sounded thinner than usual. "The hand forgets the will, Bastian. Sometimes it simply decides to let go." He didn't move to help. He stayed where he was, leaning slightly into Aiko, his thumb rubbing against his index finger in a rhythmic, desperate search for texture. Bastian stopped gathering the pieces. He looked up at his grandfather and saw not the master potter, but a man facing the slow erosion of his own autonomy. The frustration that had defined Bastian's arrival in Tuscany, the itch for speed, the hatred of the slow-drying lacquer, suddenly felt trivial. He realized that for Lorenzo, the kintsugi wasn't just about the pottery. It was a rehearsal. Every gold line was a defiance against the tremor, a way of saying that beauty could exist even as the vessel failed. Eventually, the studio was cleared. They didn't attempt a second repair that evening. The energy had shifted from creation to a quiet, exhausted acceptance. Bastian watched as Aiko guided Lorenzo toward the house, the two of them moving in a slow, synchronized orbit. He stayed behind for a few minutes, sweeping the dust into a small pile, the rhythmic scrape of the broom against the floor acting as a metronome for his thoughts. He felt a strange, hollow space opening up inside him, a void where his old anxieties used to live. He walked out onto the porch of the villa just as the light began to fail. The sky had turned a deep, bruised purple, the kind of color that felt heavy, as if the atmosphere were saturated with the scent of crushed grapes and old stone. He sat on the wide stone step, his back against the warm masonry of the house, and watched the sun dip below the jagged spine of the hills. The air had turned cool, carrying the damp, metal-sharp scent of the valley floor and the sleeping olive trees. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the secret shard. In the twilight, the handwriting on the ceramic looked like a series of scars. He didn't try to decode the words again. Instead, he just felt the edge of the piece, the way it fit into the palm of his hand. He considered the version of himself that had arrived here 3 weeks ago, the man who lived by the flicker of a screen, whose heart beat in time with notification pings and the frantic pressure of Florentine deadlines. That Bastian had been a creature of friction, always pushing against the clock, always rushing toward a finish line that didn't exist. He realized with a sudden, sharp clarity that that man was gone. He hadn't just left the city, he had been dismantled. The slow, agonizing process of cleaning shards and waiting for lacquer to cure had stripped away the layers of digital noise. But as he sat there in the purple light, he felt a strange sense of loss. It was the grief of the survivor. He missed the predictability of his anxiety, the familiar comfort of being hurried. To be still was to be vulnerable. To be present was to feel the tremor in his grandfather's hand as if it were his own. The cost of his peace was a permanent departure from the noise, and the silence that replaced it was vast and intimidating. From inside the kitchen, the low, rhythmic murmur of Lorenzo and Aiko drifted through the open door. They weren't arguing. They were speaking in those long, deliberate sentences that sounded like a conversation between 2 old books. The sound was a tether, pulling him back from the edge of his own thoughts. He leaned his head back against the stone wall, feeling the grit of the villa's foundation through his shirt. He felt heavy, not with sadness, but with a sense of grounding, as if the gravity of the place were finally claiming him, pulling him down into the soil and the history of the Moretti name. He closed his eyes, and for a second, the image of the golden veins from the bowl burned onto his eyelids, a shimmering, fractured map of a broken thing. He considered the bowl on the studio floor, waiting to be gathered and begun again. The failure wasn't the break. The failure would be to pretend the break hadn't happened. He felt the shard in his hand, and knew that eventually he would have to place it on the table. He would have to ask about the swallow and the handwriting, and he would have to accept whatever truth emerged from the rubble. As the last sliver of light vanished, the wind picked up, rustling the silver-green leaves of the olive grove. For the first time, the sound didn't feel like random noise. It felt like a conversation, a low, sibilant whisper about endurance and the long, slow sleep of the earth. Bastian let out a long, slow breath, his body sinking deeper into the stone. The world around him faded into a deep, heavy sleep, the valley breathing in the dark, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to be anywhere else.